Let me start with a question nobody ever asks, but everyone should. If every nation on Earth is drowning in debt, if every government owes more money than it can ever repay, then who exactly is collecting the bill? Because the real answer isn't a country, it's not a person, it's not even a single institution, it's a system. A system you were born into without ever being told the rules. And once you see how it works, you'll realize it was never designed to let you out. Before the world had trillion-dollar debts, before your taxes existed, before central banks became the masters of the economy, there was one moment, one idea that quietly changed everything. It didn't happen in a palace. It didn't happen at a summit. It happened because a struggling Scottish merchant, a man who had failed more times than he succeeded, walked into a desperate kingdom and made a proposal that would rewrite the economy of Earth. This man was William Paterson. England was broke, at war, running out of gold, running out of time. Traditional lenders refused new loans because England had defaulted before. Confidence was collapsing. And that's when Paterson showed up with a deal so radical, so dangerous, that even the king couldn't fully understand what he was agreeing to. Paterson offered to raise £1.2 million, a fortune back then. But here was the twist that changed the world. The government would never repay the principal, not next year, not in 50 years, not ever. They would pay interest only, forever. Imagine signing a mortgage where you never own the house. You just keep paying the bank until you die, and then your children keep paying. That's the system Paterson created. But he wasn't done. He also designed the institution that would manage this eternal loan, the Bank of England, the prototype for every central bank that followed. Here's where the real magic and the real trap begins. The lenders would hand their gold to the Bank of England. The bank would hand that gold to the government. The government would spend it on war. And then the Bank of England would issue paper money based on the government's promise to keep paying interest. Money created out of debt. It was the first time in human history that debt wasn't just a burden, it was the foundation of the entire financial system. And from that moment forward, governments no longer borrowed to repay. They borrowed because the system demanded it. They borrowed because stopping meant collapse. They borrowed because the only way to service old debt was to create new debt. That's the trap. A trap built in 1694 and still functioning today. But Paterson was only the first architect, because the second one wouldn't just make debt permanent, he would make it inescapable, not for one kingdom, but entire continents. And once his system took over, the global economy stopped being a marketplace and became a web so tightly woven that pulling one thread could bring everything crashing down.
If Paterson built the trap, then the man who came next tightened the chains. And he didn't do it with laws or armies or threats. He did it with information, and with a financial weapon no government knew how to resist. Picture Europe in the early 1800s. Empires rising, empires collapsing, new nations forming out of old ones like fractures in glass. It was a continent on fire, politically, economically, socially. In this chaos, kings needed money, lots of it. Armies needed salaries, battles needed funding, new governments needed legitimacy. And right in the center of that storm stood one family. Not royalty, not warriors, bankers. The Rothschilds. They weren't the first bankers in history, far from it, but they were the first to understand a simple truth that every economist now quietly admits. The side that controls information controls the economy. Nathan Rothschild, operating from London, built a courier network so fast, so precise, and so loyal that it could outrun government messengers. By carriage, by ship, by horseback. He received military news, political news, and financial news hours, sometimes days before anyone else in Europe. And in a world where a single rumor could move markets, that speed wasn't just an advantage, it was power. But information was only step one. Nathan's real innovation was something far more subtle and far more dangerous. He turned government debt into an industry. Before Rothschild, governments borrowed like individuals, man to man, lender to king, private deals, slow, risky, local. Rothschild industrialized the entire process. He bought entire batches of government bonds at a discount, then sold them to investors across Europe at a premium. He created the first real secondary market in sovereign debt. Suddenly, it wasn't the king owing one lender. It was the king owing thousands of investors in different countries, each one holding a piece of the kingdom's future. That meant one single truth. Defaulting was no longer just embarrassing, it was catastrophic. Because a default didn't hurt one creditor, it shook multiple nations. It could collapse banks, it could crash markets, it could trigger panic. And Rothschild knew this. He designed around this. He positioned himself so governments couldn't just borrow from him. They had to rely on him. And then came his most legendary move, the Battle of Waterloo. Reality, Napoleon is defeated, but London doesn't know yet. Ships haven't arrived. Messengers haven't reached the capital. The entire British bond market is paralyzed, waiting for news. Except Nathan Rothschild already knows. His courier reached him first. And what he did next wasn't illegal, but it was devastatingly effective. He sells British bonds. People panic. They assume Britain lost. Investors dump their holdings. Prices collapse. Then, at the deepest point of fear, Nathan buys everything back at pennies on the pound. The next day, the official messenger arrives. Britain has won. Bond prices skyrocket, and Rothschild becomes one of the wealthiest men on earth from a single, perfectly executed play. But this wasn't about Waterloo. This was about proving a point. If you control the bond market, you control governments. Because by the 1820s, every major European government, France, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, was borrowing through Rothschild channels, not because they wanted to, but because they had no alternative. The world had become financially interconnected. A default in Paris could ruin banks in Vienna. A crisis in Madrid could freeze credit in London. Europe had become a single financial organism, and the Rothschild network was its central nervous system. Debt wasn't just permanent anymore. It was global. It was interlinked. It was fragile. And escaping it was no longer a financial decision. It was a geopolitical impossibility. But as powerful as the Rothschild web was, it was still bound by one limit: gold. You could only lend what you actually had. But the next architect would erase that limit completely. He would turn borrowing into something infinite and build the most powerful money creation machine the world had ever seen. A machine born in secret, on a quiet island, behind locked doors. And his name was J.P. Morgan.
By the time Europe was tangled in Rothschild's web, the world had already changed. But America was still an outlier, powerful, rising fast, but financially chaotic. And the man who stepped in next would not just organize that chaos, he would turn it into the most powerful financial engine in human history. This is the part of the story where the debt trap stops expanding and becomes impossible to escape. When the United States entered the 1900s, its economy was growing faster than any nation on Earth. Factories were booming. Railroads were stretching across the continent. Cities were exploding with people and opportunity. But behind the scenes, Wall Street was a mess. Banks operated like islands. The money supply rose and fell randomly. And whenever fear hit the markets, everything collapsed at once, taking ordinary people down with it. Then came the panic of 1907. Markets crashed, banks failed, fortunes evaporated. Credit froze so hard that trains couldn't run, farms couldn't ship food, and entire states were days away from total shutdown. And in that moment, one man stepped forward. Not the president, not Congress, a banker. J.P. Morgan. He locked America's most powerful financiers in his library, refused to let them leave, and forced them, literally forced them, to pledge their own money to rescue the banking system. He saved the economy. But in doing so, he proved something far more dangerous. America didn't have a financial system. It had a single point of failure, one old man with a cigar. Morgan knew that couldn't last, and he knew the public would never accept a central bank run openly by Wall Street. So the plan had to be hidden. It happened in 1910 on a tiny resort in Georgia at a place called Jekyll Island. 7 men representing the most powerful banks in America boarded a private train under fake names, pretending to be duck hunters. For 9 days, they sat in a sealed conference room, drafting the blueprint of something the public had no idea was coming: the Federal Reserve. But they didn't design it to protect the people. They designed it to protect the banks. It wouldn't be called a central bank, too obvious. It wouldn't be located in one building, too suspicious. It would be split into 12 districts, each with private ownership, giving the illusion of decentralization. But the real power, the power to create money and buy government debt, was placed where they wanted it, in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Morgan's territory, Wall Street's playground. Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act in 1913 without understanding what it truly meant, and instantly the rules of the economy changed. Before the Fed, the government could only borrow what banks actually had, but after the Fed, the government could borrow as much as it wanted because the Fed could create the money from nothing by buying government bonds. That was the birth of infinite debt, the moment debt stopped being limited and became a bottomless well. But there was one more architect, the one who transformed the trap from infinite to inescapable: Paul Volcker. By the late 1970s, inflation was spiraling, the dollar was weakening, the world was losing faith, and Volcker, the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, had one mission: stop inflation, no matter the cost. He raised interest rates to 20%, the highest in U.S. history. Inflation died, but so did something else: the economic sovereignty of developing nations. Countries like Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina had borrowed billions in U.S. dollars when rates were low. But after Volcker's rate shock, their interest payments exploded overnight. They couldn't pay. They were about to default, and a global financial meltdown was seconds away. But instead of allowing the system to reset, instead of letting lenders take their losses, Volcker and the International Monetary Fund stepped in with a new strategy. Don't forgive the debt, restructure it, extend it, lock countries into it permanently. In exchange, nations were forced to cut spending, sell state assets, open markets for foreign corporations, and surrender control over their own economies. They didn't escape debt, they were absorbed by it. And that's the final design of the trap: permanent debt, global debt, infinite debt, inescapable debt. A system built not by conspiracy, but by 4 men solving 4 different problems in 4 different centuries, each solution tightening the same net around the world. And now, here we are. Every major economy owes more than it can ever repay. Every currency is backed by government debt. Every financial institution depends on the interest that flows from that debt. And every taxpayer, every worker, every saver on earth is feeding a machine created long before they were born. A machine that doesn't malfunction when debt skyrockets, it requires it. Because in this system, debt isn't a flaw. Debt is the product. Debt is the engine. Debt is the lifeblood. And escape? There is none. Not without collapsing the very foundation the global economy stands on. Now you see the truth. They didn't just design a system you can't escape. They designed a world you can't escape.